right. I am once again joined by This is Revolution's, I'm not quite sure what the title is, foreign
Deep
policy.
state Kuba.
All right. Deep State Kuba from This is Revolution. So we are going to finish what we started last week, which was the debate that Jacobin staff writer Branko Marcetic had with New York Magazine's Eric Levitz about the left in Ukraine, and both in terms of political strategy and also just in terms of what the right position is. How we should feel about the sort of massive massive level of U.S. involvement in this war in Ukraine, which just got considerably more massive. I mean, there was just passed a $40 billion, I believe, aid package to Ukraine.
Yes, that's in addition to the $40 billion aid package, there's been developments on the ground that are rather disturbing. Escalation, which is that the first Russian casualties, civilians, from indirect attacks from artillery fire, cross-border artillery fire, were sustained over the last couple of days. And which really does signal a new phase and an escalation in the conflict. If Russian borders aren't sacrosanct, then the possibility of a continued escalation and broadening of the geography of the conflict is possible.
Yeah, I mean, just the thought of Russian targets getting hit in Russia with American the American weapons, and and add to that some of what we were talking about last week, which is this little drum roll there's been of I guess your colleagues at the deep state bragging to the New York Times about their involvement in military operations, which is not great. I would think, if I were working at the CIA or military intelligence or whatever it is, I would perhaps try to tamp down on this, because I see no good that could possibly come with this being broadcast all around the world.
I think that you're absolutely right, and one fundamental problem of American strategic planning is that policy gets implemented, executed, developed within this political and bureaucratic competitive pressure cooker, where you have politicians that have to respond to developments in the media environment, and that they're accountable to donors that might panic or that might have very keen interests on particular issues. But also the deep state apparatus is no longer autonomous. It's attached to so many political offices, to so many contractors, to so many businesses, to so many political cliques, that you have foreign policy that nominally should belong to some kind of national security strategy that is instead executed or delivered with a view to career advancement or to the advancement of factional interests and political victory domestically, which leads to very, very dangerous moves. Because if you think about Russia, if you think about Putin, how does he know which moves, foreign policy-wise, that the United States makes are part of its actual strategy versus which ones are designed for a sectional or corporate interest satisfaction? And that creates a very dangerous noise that prevents any actor on any side, including allies as well, from getting a stable reading on what America's plan might be, to the point where arguably the question becomes, does America have a longer term plan, or is it entirely reactive?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I should, while we're talking about sectional interests, by the way, just a random piece of information that, I happened to, come across the other day that hadn't previously been on my radar, but, it's like, this isn't the most significant thing in itself. I think this is just kind of the American political system being what it is, but I think it is striking that literally at the time that he was picked for this position, Lloyd Austin, who's the current Secretary of Defense, was on the board of directors of Raytheon, which seems like the kind of thing that in a different political landscape might be considered to be a troubling conflict of interest.
Yeah, and there was some would take the position that, look, this has just been the system in place, the kind of career trajectory, the patronage and political promotion system that's been around since the 80s, since the 70s, since after World War II. That's just not the case. There was a more significant barrier between the bureaucratic services in terms of the American state, whether security services, military services, the professional civil service, the State Department, and the not necessarily the peak economic movers, right? You do have things like the fruit wars, right. But on a personnel level, you weren't going to retire to work for Raytheon. Right. You were going to retire to a house in the country and go fishing. What we have today, where retired officials sit on boards of directors for financial companies, for military contractors, and receive compensation that dwarfs what they were earning in public service, the scale and the regularity of it, the fact that this is the rule, this is the law of the land. If it's not that saying no to the offer is even considered to be a reasonable or principled position anymore, just a kind of career insanity. Right. That extent of interpenetration between private interests and national defense strategy is new, and I think fatally compromising to any attempts to create a durable national security architecture for how America behaves in the world. And consequently, the rest of the world can't do that either, because an unreliable, chaotic America destabilizes any attempt to actually produce in practice what is often called a rules-based liberal order.
Yeah, right. And I should, so I had two quick points about this. One is that, I guess I should really also have said, when I said, use the example about Lloyd Austin, that that it's, that immediately before Raytheon, right, he was in the military, and in fact, to hire him as Secretary of Defense, they had to get a waiver from for the law that's been in place since 1949, which originally said you had to have 10 years in between military service and holding this.
Yeah. And in 1949, when these laws were passed, and in the generation beyond it, people didn't get the waiver. One, there was a stigma to even ask, right? Because it is you're asking for special treatment. You better have a good reason. Right. And the applications weren't seen as a routine exercise of what's basically your constitutional right, but as an extraordinary request that required careful adjudication and was often denied. Now, I can't think of anyone under any conditions who gets denied that kind of waiver.
Right.
It's not even an issue. You have to look it up, right, to understand that this is potentially something disqualifying. right? But the Republicans don't run that as part of their confirmation hearings because it's been normalized to such an extent across the entire system that all of their candidates would also be disqualified.
Right. Yeah. No. And this is. Yeah. And I mean, I mean, I think this is all really disturbing. And I should also say, like, this $40 billion aid package that just passed, which is like, I mean, obviously we should talk about it in terms of what that means about, the war in Ukraine and any hopes for, for a decent negotiated outcome in that, as opposed to just dragging on forever and all of that. But also just in terms of domestic American politics, I mean, like, I think we shouldn't like let our eyes get too far off the ball of this being, this being a huge giveaway to weapons manufacturers. I mean, like that's like and again, like, given this level of interpenetration between, the government and those weapons manufacturers, is a really, is kind of the hand feeding itself.
To a certain extent, part of me just thinks, look, just pay the upper echelon, the sort of top 15% of bureaucrats, military officers, government positions, pay them $10 billion a year each, right? Just remove any pecuniary incentive from their lives, because you're going to end up doing that anyway. They're all going to end up with a fortune, except now it has to be laundered and filtered through a military-industrial complex that has a lot of rent-seeking middlemen that will inflate those numbers even further.
Yeah. But to move towards the actual impact on the war in Ukraine, something I've seen, I've not had a chance to finish reading the article yet, but Nathan Robinson has a piece on the proxy war question in Current Affairs right now. That what I read was very good, but like, this is this weird thing that you're starting to get people like, I do not remember his name, you probably know, but there's a member of Congress who sits on the defense committee, who said on TV on Fox News that we're not just fighting on behalf of the Ukrainians, we're also fighting, we're fighting a proxy war with Russia, for our own reasons, which is a pretty remarkable thing to say. But then you start to hook that up with things that the Biden and Biden administration officials have started to say lately about how the goal is not just to get Russia to withdraw from Ukraine, which would be ambitious enough if they're going to do that completely, but the goal is to weaken Russia to the point where it can't invade any more countries, which is a pretty amazing thing to say. I mean, like, what would it actually take to weaken Russia to the point where it didn't have that capacity anymore?
Well, a number of possibilities spring to mind, and one is that this is part of a retread of the kind of like mad dog strategy that Nixon wanted to employ in Vietnam, that they're leaking this because they don't mean it, right? They want to scare Putin a little by underlying the power that they do have to change the basis of the conflict, and that there is a constituency that advocates it within the U.S., but it's just a pressure move in terms of negotiations. And ideally, that's the case. Because the alternative, I think, moving from sort of pure kabuki to a bit of strategic bite, if you're thinking about weakening Russia to such a point, then, and you believe that it can be brought about by destabilizing Ukraine, not by invading Russia proper, not by bombing Moscow, but if we just apply enough pressure in Ukraine, we can weaken Russia, then you're basically betting on state failure.
Right.
That applying concerted economic, security, political, diplomatic pressure on Russia, together with the material and social costs of a losing war in Ukraine, will dissolve the apparatus of power. And maybe you'll have breakaway republics. Maybe you'll have warlords. Maybe you'll have something else. But whatever it is, it's not that it'll be friendlier to the West, but it will lose the ability to collectively organize in the same way as an effective Russian state, and therefore will be weaker, right? Less capable of challenging the rest of the world. But that's an extraordinarily grim scenario to wish on the people of Russia.
Yeah, it's a horrible thing to wish on the people of Russia. And it's also, I mean, I think
dangerous.
It's also dangerous for the rest of the world. I mean, this is like, I mean, just thinking about the idea of that happening to a major nuclear power. I mean, that's pretty, that's pretty grim.
Incidentally, also, without even going that far in terms of the ambitions vis-a-vis Russia, by trying to engineer a protracted war, you're definitely wishing that condition on the people of Ukraine, right, that they will live in a war zone. Their country will be plundered and destroyed, and that you'll end up with an impoverished and violence, traumatized population. That's what's in the offing if this does become a protracted conflict.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, so this is actually, so I mentioned this article by Nathan Robinson at the end, and he's got this, he's got this analogy, actually, in a footnote that is, it's a sort of self-consciously goofy analogy, but I think it gets something, where he says, let me tell a rather silly story just to remind us that one can help someone without having their best interests at heart. Let's say you were at a bar and a fight breaks out. A big thug, let's call him Big Bad Leroy Brown, has started pummeling some innocent little pipsqueak, which Leroy tends to do when he drink. You've done the same yourself from time to time. You have grown tired of Leroy's influence in the bar. Know you can try to pull. You who have grown tired of Leroy's influence in the bar, know you can try to pull the fighting pair apart. Leroy's influence would be undiminished, but the pipsqueak would emerge relatively unscathed. On the other hand, instead of stopping the fight, you could hand the pipsqueak a set of brass knuckles and a knife in the hopes of giving him a fair chance. Hell, he might even kill Leroy, which would solve your problem. Of course, he might also be killed himself, which is in fact quite probable. Let us ask a question. If instead of trying to end the fight, you had weapons to the pipsqueak and cheer him on in the hopes that he'll humiliate your rival, would it be fair to characterize you as having altruistic motives towards the poor pipsqueak? I would argue that, in fact, you simply use this person without having any regard for their life. So.
Well, and I think that there's actually something missing from that story, and something salient that matters a great deal, which is the pipsqueak might not actually be fighting for his life. He might be fighting for his honor. Right. And the idea of individual or national collective honor being an adequate reason to risk death, to inflict death on others, is for a lot of socialists and internationalists, cosmopolitans, alien, right, and difficult to assimilate or empathize with. A kind of derangement, maybe, taken to an extreme. Yeah. But the idea of an honor of Ukraine, Slava Ukraina, right? Like this, the pipsqueak may not care about his life. He may care about his honor, and the fact that you are helping him die with dignity, if that's how it ends, is not for him a betrayal. That's a reading that I think exists in the world that the left has difficulty recognizing, let alone answering.
Fair enough. Okay, well, there's a lot more we could say here, but we should probably start in on the actual debate. So I think this should be primed to start where we left off last week. So we basically had gotten both Branko and Eric's opening statements. Just to kind of recap in a basic way. I think Branko is very concerned about the many possible bad effects of flooding a conflict zone that's already been an imported weapons black market with weapons, and is very keen to have a negotiated solution to end the war quickly. And Eric sort of kind of briefly made the point that, well, some could argue that you need to give them the operational ability to really fight it out, for the Russians to have an incentive to go for that negotiated solution. But a lot of I think it would be fair to say at least part of what seems to be motivating Eric here is a concern about political strategy, that like, is this the hill you want to die on? That the is opposing arming people who are, after all, whatever else is true, fighting off a really horrendous imperialist war of aggression, and given the you would be really careful about this, given the sort of overwhelming American support, for the Ukrainian cause. You need a really good argument. Something like that seemed to be
basically
what he said. Yeah.
Yeah, basically a kind of respectability argument that if you're going to push a policy line, a policy position that runs against mainstream populist instinct, then you're going to need a pretty good intellectual alibi, a pretty good intellectual argument.
Right.
Just from the perspective of winning hearts and minds, if you will. And that's true. It's a perfectly legitimate point as far as it goes.
No, I think seconded. Yeah, I think it is. I think, we got into a lot of the sort of particulars of more things you could say about this last time, but we should probably just pick up.
Head right on in.
Yep.
So I'll say up front that I think that in Branko's response to me, I think the strongest point, which he sort of referenced at the end there, I failed to acknowledge the existence, of Ukraine's far right in my piece, and I do think that was a genuine oversight, and I take his argument very seriously, and I guess my general I'm still navigating, trying to navigate this situation with humility as someone who is by no means a expert on this region or this nation. But I guess I have sort of some questions about, Branko's argument. So I think that there's just a little bit of a disconnect in the analogy with Afghanistan, right, where the direct object of our aid and the agent that we were empowering in a conflict were directly the extremists themselves, the Mujahideen, whereas here we are arming a sovereign, legitimate government that has within its defense forces a prominent but fundamentally very small minority that are comprised of far-right militias. So I think this is an important distinction because it complicates, I think, the implications that this arming policy potentially has. At least, it seems to me, at least, it's not obvious to me that arming the Ukrainian government and its formal military would strengthen the nation's far right. In my understanding, the Azov Battalion and other far-right militias that comprise a tiny fraction of the Ukraine. In my understanding, that they comprise a tiny fraction of Ukraine's defense forces. And it's also my understanding that, part of why Azov played such an outsized role in Ukraine's defense following Putin's 2014 invasion, and why they were incorporated into the Ukrainian National Guard, was in part because the nation's formal military was weak. And there was the reason why the Ukrainian government felt compelled and does feel compelled to rely on and cooperate with fighters who, in Branko's own account, pose a threat to its own leadership, pose a threat to, Zelensky, is because of the limits of the state's formal military capacity. So it therefore seems at least possible to me that strengthening the formal military would reduce the leverage that far-right militias can exercise over Kiev, while also increasing the central government's capacity to crack down on the far-right militias in a post-war situation.
I think that this would be a good place to pause.
Separately from that, I believe that some.
I think that here we've hit a significant obstacle or significant problem in Eric's thinking. And when he distinguished at the beginning the Afghanistan and Ukraine conflict, saying that in Afghanistan we were arming the radicals, in Ukraine we're arming a legitimate, recognized government. And there is no magic that happens when you walk into a capital and you become the recognized government that changes the institutional basis. There's nothing special about recognized governments that make them more moderate or more effective. It just diplomatically comes down to who you inherited rule from, whether or not you have the UN seat in New York, whether or not you have diplomatic recognition from the key capitals. And that confusion then leads him to reify, to create this image that there's a formal Ukrainian military that are reliable, that constitutionally minded, that are the respectable actors. And they are counterposed to the far-right militias. And if we strengthen the formal military, it'll be a balanced. It represents a kind of zero-sum loss of power for the alternative far-right militias. But the state isn't that kind of institution. The Ukrainian state isn't this respectability machine that is designed to sort of carry out sacred constitutional processes in a disinterested way. The Ukrainian state is, first of all, accidental, right? It's the legacy of the party state of the former Soviet Union that administered this territory. And it wasn't designed to be a bulwark of liberal democracy against domestic far-right groups. That's not its purpose, and that isn't. It hasn't had to build the cultural capacity, the bureaucratic commitment, the organizational structures to do that. So that's one. Like, the state isn't there to keep the far right down. Right. Two, the far right is already inside the state. The formal military includes elements like National Guard units that are just the far-right militia legalized after 2014. So the aid that's going to the quote-unquote formal Ukrainian military, part of that is arriving in the hands of formal military units that are fascist far-right militias. Also, there isn't a clear line between people who belong to these units and have far-right ideologies and people who belong to units that are sort of Soviet legacies or have some other more respectable, more neutral origin, but might have far-right sympathies anyway. To a large extent, the fact that far-right militia fight for Ukrainian honor and win and seem to be effective, seem to be strong, seem to be powerful, and seem to be ours, makes them appealing to Ukrainians who don't really have an ideological stake in the far right sort of value system, but who do have sort of patriotic sentiment. And there's a risk, right, that this happens even in the military, where actually you're most likely to be exposed to individual acts of valor by far-right militia, right? Where you're much more likely to have your life saved by a fascist. So you can't assume that the formal military is going to be a force that pushes against a rightward drift in the country. One could even see a situation in which, if the war goes on long enough, and both Zelensky and the far right and the Azov battalion survive, show courage, show commitment, if this goes on for 3 or 4 years, you might actually have a synthesis where a Jewish president becomes acceptable as part of this, an honorary Aryan in this far-right mythos because of the shared experience. But rather than making the far-right less anti-Semitic, it just pulls in a bunch of formerly non-extremist Ukrainian nationalists into treating the far-right with respectability.
Yeah, right. And I think also, I think that even within the structure of what Eric is saying here, there's a little bit of a tension, that like on the one hand, there's this sort of relatively sharp distinction being made between the Ukrainian state and the far right, militias, and on the other hand, there's this acknowledgement, that the reason, which fair enough, is that they've been willing to work with these fighters is the relative weakness of the the Ukrainian state, of the regular military. But I mean, the more the second thing is true, right? The less the first thing is true, right? Like another way, like if you're if you're weak enough to be desperate enough to accept help from Nazis, right, that might make it more understandable and reasonable that you'd accept that help. But like, it also should make us more worried about whether you're in a position to you're in a position to fend them off. More worried about the possible consequences of like greater military power going to those Nazis.
And the truth is too that the outsiders that aren't subject to the existential struggle of a life or death war would like to have ideological clarity. Is Zelensky really committed to liberal democracy? Mm-hmm. Or is the Azov battalion, are they really Nazis? Is the pro-Russian opposition in Ukraine really just Putin's stooges? And they would like a clear answer to those questions. But under the conditions of struggling for survival, right, and with the stress of having your life at risk every single day, and not just yours, but the future of your entire society, your family, everyone close to you, every day is a potential apocalypse. The calculus that creates political alliances, that motivates policy choices, might have nothing to do with that ideological clarity. It may come down to personal relationships between individual leaders. It might come down to extraordinary circumstances that a particular commander finds themselves in. And it could break any number of ways. A conflict like this is an extremely turbulent event, and it unmoors individuals as well as societies. how they're reformed is not predictable. But I will say that the starting position where you have powerful right-wing militias that are potential war heroes, potential saviors of the nation, and potential recipients of advanced weaponry from the West, that's not a good starting position to run those scenarios. There's a lot of ways that it goes unexpectedly bad, more than unexpectedly good.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And I think that it's, I mean, it's just a very strange thing, actually. Also, maybe you could, just quickly speak to this before we go back to the debate, that like thinking about the way that that American discourse is on the Ukrainian far right question, that, when early on, Ilhan Omar suggested that we want to be real careful that none of this aid, goes to Azov and other far right, battalions. She was really slammed very hard for that, and whatever. I mean, she's backed down. I mean, I think the entire squad, voted for this aid package. But you compare that to like Syria, and in Syria, I mean, Syrian rebels were fighting against. I mean, like they were engaged in a pretty existential struggle too, I mean, like against a regime that was willing to, engage in some like really brutal war crimes, to suppress any kind of opposition. But at least officially, right, at least nominally, there was all this like concern in the American political establishment to make sure that no American military aid, went to extremists, and that was like a completely normal thing to worry about. Everybody worried about that. The only real sort of dispute is like, are there is there some element of moderate rebels who would be an acceptable recipient for all this aid? So what do you think accounts for the difference between the two situations where now this is just like, I mean, is it just that like Putin made these kind of ludicrous claims about being motivated by denazification? So now, now if you bring this up, you're agreeing with Putin, or I mean, what's going on here?
So I think part of it has to do with the fact that ISIS and Al-Qaeda, like the face of Islamic terror, is the face of the American enemy. Yeah. Impossible to, there's no sympathy there, and a profound feeling of immediate threat, right? Basically, everyone who can vote knows about September 11th and has strong instinctive reaction about it. While after 80 years of distance from World War II, and not just distance, but its reflection through video games, through movies, through pop culture, through ironic appropriation of fascist iconography, through BD and S&M, you name it. Right. The response, the instinctive revulsion of far-right groups that are associated with white supremacy or National Socialism. Mm-hmm. I think that for many Westerners who are white, they don't have that instinctive enmity towards the far right. Everybody, I suspect that an uncomfortable proportion of Americans have an ironic Nazi friend. You might have an ironic Nazi friend, or somebody on the internet that you trade memes with that like might get colorful on certain topics in a way that tankies sometimes can get with respect to Soviet war crimes or far left atrocities. Right. And that normalization, I think, makes it easier to gloss over the real implications of arming the far right. And Putin hasn't helped either. by being so hypocritical about denazification, right? On the one hand, making this a literal casus belli, but hiring the Wagner group to carry out the denazification. That weakens significantly the integrity of the taboo around normalizing National Socialism, especially, unfortunately too, especially in military circles and security circles. I think that process of normalization, of treating like the Third Reich and the far right in general as just one flavor among others, what some might call moral relativism of the right, it's moved pretty far along. So you'll have people who don't really have a political view on any of the sort of substantive ideological issues of National Socialism or fascists in general, say things like, well, they fought really well. They were really brave, right? Look at those uniforms.
Right.
And under normal circumstances, right, I absolutely wouldn't care. Right. Because, have you seen those uniforms? They are actually pretty amazing. But it is dangerous when that type of aesthetic distance morphs into the weakening of ideological taboos, which, I'm generally speaking, I'm in favor of diversity and toleration, but literal Nazis, right? Like literal Nazis.
Yeah, you should probably have some taboos against Nazis. All right, let's get back to the debate.
Some of the heaviest fighting thus far and heaviest Ukrainian casualties have been concentrated in Mariupol, where the Azov battalion or regiment is concentrated. And so it at least seems possible to me that the percentage of Ukraine's, or rather that Ukraine's neo-Nazi defenders are dying at a much higher rate than its non-far right militia military, and thus becoming a smaller sort of fraction of its forces. And so I think that there's at least potentially that Putin's partial denazification of Ukraine might actually mitigate the problem that Branko raises. I guess the other issue here is that it's just not clear to me what the counterfactual is. I mean, I think that it's a problem for every argument, maybe, for all sides in this argument and in this conflict. It's such a difficult situation that it's hard to see what the alternative that is really plausible and that is acceptable is. But if we choke off all military aid to Ukraine, so as to deny weapons to its far right members, what happens? Ukraine, has fascistic militias within its National Guard, but I think Russia's government, currently, especially this wartime regime, bears no small number of similarities to fascist regimes historically. LGBT Ukrainians will not live well if their lives are shadowed by the Azov battalion, but they wouldn't live well under Putinism either. And then, separately, it seems to me that in a scenario where Kiev fell, where Ukraine's sovereign government, fell, and far-right militias became sort of the locus of resistance to a reviled sort of Russian puppet regime, that the far-right might actually thrive under that scenario as well. It also seems to me that before all this started, before weapons entered the country, that I would imagine that these far-right militants were among the most well-armed Ukrainians in the country. So it's not obvious to me that the net effect of this military aid is to strengthen the relative power of the Ukrainian far right, their power relative to the rest of Ukrainian society and the Ukrainian government. It seems plausible to me. Don't get me wrong, but I guess I'm not. It's not clear to me that is what the implication would be. I will say separately that I do have my own concerns about the implications of arming Ukraine that include the one that Branko has emphasized with the far right, as well as this question of, it seems like territorial concessions are going to be a precondition for any, agreement that Putin is going to accept. It seems to me that not really plausible that Ukraine can drive Russian forces out of the Donbass. And there's really staunch resistance to that within Ukrainian society. And so the question of whether or not in maintaining Ukraine's capacities militarily, does that sort of solidify intransigence that makes this impossible? That is something that concerns me, because I think, all else equal, very much think that, for all its faults, the, fledgling form of capitalist democracy, however corrupt and, with authoritarian tendencies and nationalist ones, Ukraine is, it is a less unfree form of government than Putinism. So I would like to see Ukraine maintain as much sovereignty as it can. At the same time, I think peace, war is hell, and I think that expediting the return of peace should be the number one objective here. And it's just not clear to me what actual policy course is conducive to that. And to that point, there was just one other thing that I wanted to raise, because it's a question that that I'm curious what Branko thinks on, and I'm not fully settled on it myself, but it seems to me when I'm reading about the negotiations between Ukraine and Russia, it seems to me that there has been progress. Ukraine has offered to forswear NATO membership, has expressed comfort with committing to neutrality between Russia and the West, so not involving itself in their conflicts, not hosting foreign military bases, etc., among other things. But what, in every report that I've seen, an absolute precondition for those concessions from the Ukrainian government has been the receipt of security guarantees from third-party powers, generally from Western powers. And, it's often viewed as like a consortium of like Turkey, China, Germany, France, and the US or something, all saying that they will, basically making a commitment that if in the event of future aggression against Ukraine, we will come to its defense. And this is a real sticking point for Ukraine, I think, understandably, because, their experience in 2014 is when Russia comes and conquers part of your territory, there's a very good chance that they're going to build up their forces over a period of years and come and conquer more of your territory. And if you do concede the Donbass and move the border between Russia, and, the Ukrainian capital closer, you move that border westward. If you make peace after Russia has decimated the Ukrainian military industrial base, you're kind of setting yourself up potentially to be reinvaded within a few years. And that is, it's already a difficult challenge that Zelensky has, selling concessions to the Ukrainian people in terms of territory, especially. And so it's been really emphasized that the way that he believes he can sell that is with pairing this, okay, we give this up, but that's the end of it. We have these security guarantees that ensure that Russia is not going to reinvade. So that seems like critical to a deal, yet it also effectively means the US committing to confrontation with a nuclear superpower in the event that it invades Ukraine in the future. And so I'm wondering, whether Branko supports the extension of such security guarantees, and if not, how do we imagine, peace and an agreement being reached here? Because I have trouble seeing it.
Yeah, well, first of all, let me deal with the some of the points brought up about on the far right. For one, I mentioned the Maidan Revolution, where the far right were using kind of hunting rifles and other kind of relatively low-level weapons. I mentioned the incident outside of the Ukrainian parliament where grenades were thrown, or a grenade was thrown. Now, imagine if those confrontations, instead of those weapons, you had militias armed with actual assault rifles and grenade launchers and missiles. I mean, I think this is what we have to, and copious grenades. As far as whether Azov is eliminated, I have no idea, because there's a lot of stuff that is just said out there about this war that doesn't end up coming true. That may well be true, but the Azov regiment was part of a wider movement. The Azov regiment was the only far-right militia integrated into the Ukrainian National Guard, but it's not the only far-right militia out there, and nor is it the sort of the be-all and end-all of the wider Azov movement. There are others out there. In terms of if the state could end up better putting down or cracking down on these groups, there's really serious reasons to doubt that. For one, I mean, the fact that the Azov regiment were brought into the actual official security forces of Ukraine gives you a hint about how the members of the Ukrainian government, not all of them, but are not necessarily unsympathetic to some of these far-right groups, or at the very least, they see them as being able to control them. The Interior Minister, Arsen Avakov, he was the one who brought them in because he was kind of allied with them, and he believed that they were kind of the key to his political rise. There has been reports for a long time in Ukraine that when far-right groups attack LGBTQ protests, the Roma people, others, when they disrupt city council meetings, or they attack left-wing organizing meetings, so on and so forth, the police don't end up doing anything. And one thing to note is that pre-war, there were ultra-nationalists who were part of the Ukrainian police hierarchy in key posts. But police didn't always actually end up arresting or doing anything to the far-right militias. They sometimes would actually arrest the people being attacked. It's not, I don't think it's quite as simple as thinking, well, now that there's more guns in Ukraine, and a lot of those guns, Ukraine is one of the biggest arms trafficking black holes in Europe. So those guns that have just been sent in there, a lot of them are going to disappear and end up somewhere else in the hands of other people. Also, the fact that Zelensky himself said, I'm giving guns to every man, woman, and child who wants to fight, doesn't exactly suggest that they have been kind of, they're doing background checks on every single person before they hand out some of these things. So I think all that's worth remembering. I think it's also worth remembering that the US, in sending these weapons and basically urging other countries or goading other countries to do the same, it's not doing it with the aim of allowing Ukraine to win. The explicit aim, and one of my big disagreements with Eric's piece is he treats this as a kind of hypothetical, as a kind of a trick for, I guess, myself or people on the left to kind of avoid dealing with some of the messy realities of the war. But in fact, it's not a hypothetical. This is a real strategy that is actually existing among US officials. They want to turn Ukraine into what Afghanistan was for the Soviets in the 80s, what Vietnam was for the United States in the 60s and 70s. They couldn't care less. I'm very sorry to tell everyone, but the people in the Biden administration could not care less about Ukrainians. What they want is they want to draw Russia into a protracted conflict that, even if Russia has a superior military force, if they are constantly having people being killed by a guerrilla insurgency that lasts years and years and years, that hopefully will end up destabilizing the country or weaken it so that they can then confront China without having a united Russian and Chinese front. And I think also potentially, maybe not the explicit goal, although I would urge people to read the piece that Niall Ferguson wrote for Bloomberg, where he quotes a senior administration official, quote unquote, explicitly saying that they hope that, ultimately what's going to happen is Putin gets thrown out. But that is also another ancillary, aim of this whole thing. We have to remember that the people running foreign policy, particularly in the United States, but in a lot of Western countries where foreign policy, the national security state is taken out of democratic hands, and it's basically just decided on by a small elite in rooms. They have very different interests than the kind of humanitarian ones that, quite justifiably animate all of us here. And I think most ordinary people, they have something else going. And I think at this point, if you read the reporting since December, if you read, there was that David Sanger piece in the New York Times last week, I think it's not really tenable to say that this is just a hypothetical, that the US isn't explicitly trying to make this happen. Now, what could be done instead? My preference is not to have, Russia lording over a puppet regime in Kiev. I don't think that's anyone's preference. But again, because of the real dangers of just sending arms into this, the potential for destabilization in the near future in Ukraine, we have to do something else. And the thing that I have put forward, the thing that others keep calling for, including Zelensky himself, is the US, and not just the US, but the US needs to enter these negotiations. Unless we basically just go for the complete destruction of Ukraine, this war, like every war, is going to end with people in a room across a table from each other talking. And that is happening now between Russia and Ukraine, but it is not happening with US officials. And that's a mistake, both A, because US officials, whatever you think about the sanctions, they've imposed the sanctions. They are the ones who control the lever there. They're also, even though they're not directly fighting,
I think it's worth pausing here for a bit, because there's something that we should talk about before they pivot to negotiations and a kind of plan forward. And Branko points to some of the consequences that comes from shipping weapons into a country that's in the condition of Ukraine. That there's already been violence in Ukrainian politics, that we've already had far-right groups using armed violence to push their political goals, and it's been effective as well. It's not that the perpetrators of the violence are rotting in a prison, or Timothy McVeigh was executed for bombing, but the IDAR battalion, which was behind the death of a number of Russophone trade unionists, including teenagers in Odessa, they got incorporated into the regular national security apparatus of Ukraine. So,
right, which goes to the point about it being a broader issue than just the Azov battalion.
Yes, and if I'd like to link the question of the conflict and the arms shipments to some other developments that are going to have repercussions not just in Ukraine, but all across Europe. Something like 6 million Ukrainian refugees have left the country. Those were the UN figures as of May 11th, but the UN often underestimates this. It could be more. Over 3 million of those, 3.2 million, I believe, have arrived in Poland. Poland has a population of about 37 million. So 9% population bump from Ukrainian refugees. Those Ukrainians will not be able to return unless there's a peaceful and stable Ukraine, which offers them some hope of a normal life, and more than a normal life, more than a safe life, but something like the prosperity and stability and safety that they are going to experience over the next few years in the EU. Otherwise, they're going to become a permanent migrant population in the EU. I don't have a problem with that. Great. Sure. The EU needs more people, especially young people. And if Ukrainian refugees are finding that this is a path to a better life, please take advantage of it, right? Make the most of it for each individual family. But there are knock-on effects that we have to reckon with, especially if that refugee population suffers discrimination, becomes an underclass. That's a concern. It may happen. Europeans tend to be slow with legalization, but when it comes completely. Ukrainians are popular, so they may get citizenship or some kind of durable status sooner than other refugee groups. It might happen quicker, and with that comes assimilation into the economy and into the society. But as long as there's a conflict which is embroiling their families and their homeland in brutal warfare,
Right.
then that population will carry trauma and be in contact with this experience of flight, of dispossession, of violence. People they know will have died. Many will have lost their homes. And in the internal narrative of that struggle, far-right groups may become heroes. And there was an issue among Irish Americans, for instance,
right,
of radicalization around the IRA, the provisional IRA, the real IRA, all of the offshoots, the more radical offshoots,
yeah,
could tap into Irish nationalism in the diaspora community to foment their ideology, to get converts, to get recruits, and to fundraise. So you have a question of whether, and this is not a reason to deny refugee status to anybody.
sure,
but it is a concern that we're going to have to reckon with, right? The part of the support that Ukrainians need in the resettlement process will also be introduction and persuasion towards like civic notions of identity, away from the romanticization of national struggle, because otherwise there's a real risk that personal networks and this trauma from living with conflict will create another segment of the radical right in Europe. Also, part of some of the most dangerous criminal groups during the 1990s in Russia, and generally speaking, some of the most dangerous criminal groups that exist in any modern society, come out of groups of veterans or people with military experience that have been radicalized in losing wars, because you get the training to work effectively, work in clandestine ways, work secretly, to violate the rules of everyday life. You have a network of comrades, people that you can trust, people that can move information, that can move resources, and that can perform violence if necessary. Now, if they're attached to a right-wing, a radical right-wing ideology with sympathizers in Western countries, right, then the ironic Nazi that might be in your friend group may end up being mentored by an actual fighter who knows what it is to liquidate people,
right,
and might look up to that guy. I feel like I'm being very depressing.
a little bit. But yeah, it is worth, I mean, it is a thing that's worth talking about. I mean, I think, I mean, hot take time. I do think Nazis are pretty bad. So, I think that this is all worth taking a lot more seriously than it's taken in like 99% of American discourse about the Ukraine war.
And also, I mean, the American discourse about the Ukraine war wants to flatten this into a Hollywood story, into something, Zelensky, the Steven Spielberg story, right? Like the Saving Private Ivanov, right? Like, but the the kind of notion and the sort of default assumption that Eric made earlier, that the formalized military and the internationally recognized Ukrainian government are going to be somehow analogous with a Schoolhouse Rock vision of American civics. That error is extraordinarily common all across American society. And that's essentially a default position that many Americans slap onto many different countries in different contexts. And the truth is that the liberal constitutional sort of rules-based civic model of government and statehood is far from hegemonic in Eastern Europe. I like to, sometimes when people ask me about Poland, I say, well, the bad news is that Polish political culture is half fascist. The good news is it's only half fascist, right? In some European countries, Poland included, there is a robust liberal nationalism to push against ethno-nationalism, romantic nationalism. In Ukraine, there's even less than 50%, right? The number of true blue liberal sort of First Amendment Ukrainians is going to be 10% maybe, and most of them will join the 6 million that are in Europe.
Right.
The ones who will stay, the most likely to stay, are actually the ones with a strong romantic commitment to national honor. And I'm not saying they're far right, but I am saying that they're not.
There's going to be a group with a higher proportion of far right people.
Yes, you're going to have some saints staying and fighting and really glorious actual national heroes. You're also going to get some throat slitters. And unfortunately, the people who stay will be the ones who write the future of Ukraine. The exiles will have a difficult time coming back and trying to reassert some kind of leadership. There's a reason why Poroshenko has been just written out of, not Poroshenko, sorry, Yanukovych has been just written out of Ukrainian political life. By fleeing to Russia, he disqualified himself. Zelensky, by staying, is doing himself, and Ukraine a great service by giving them what might be a liberal civic national leader. But you also have to think about all of the other people who make that choice. Are there going to be enough cadres that give a damn about minority rights, that give a damn about constitutional or democratic respectability? Or will it be Zelensky and a lot of far-right people with a ton of soft nationalists in between?
So in the chat, Jacob says, so you all reckon the LAPD has a higher or lower percentage of Nazis than the Ukrainian military? No idea, but I'd also have some serious concerns about sending the LAPD tens of billions of dollars of heavy military equipment.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think the LAPD should necessarily be running law and order in LA.
Right.
I certainly wouldn't empower them to. I certainly wouldn't want them doing law and order over large Hispanic immigrant communities, some of, proportion of which will be undocumented. Oh, wait, isn't that working out great? Right.
Fair enough. All right, let's get back to it.
Directly fighting this war. They are militarily intervening in the country, and so they should be party to these negotiations, as should NATO. Because if you are going to create some sort of stable security arrangement, I don't know what exactly that would look like, but if you're going to create one, you have to have those countries there, negotiating and talking about what that actually looks like. I think also China should enter. China's not involved in this war as the US and NATO are, but China is sticking by its kind of alliance, friendship, whatever you want to call it, with Russia. It is kind of the larger, in the same way that the US is the larger power behind NATO. China is kind of the larger power behind Russia. It makes sense for them to come in and to be able to sort of broker some sort of deal. In terms of the specifics of that, I cannot tell you what at least off the cuff here, what a stable security arrangement is going to look like. That's going to be something that has to be decided by all those people in a room figuring out something that works for everyone. But I think that's what needs to be done. There is no real, unfortunately, no real pressure on the Biden administration to come into these negotiations at all. The media is either, why aren't you implementing a no-fly zone? Were you too quick to rule out World War III? Were you too quick to rule out nuclear holocaust? Or it's the kind of more soft military intervention. Let's send weapons in. I think there needs to be far more of a stress on diplomacy. I'm not the only one. Veteran diplomats and other foreign policy experts are out there. They've been saying this for a while. The only way this is going to end is through a settlement. The US should enter these negotiations. I think in terms of, again, what a security arrangement looks like post-fact, whether I'd be comfortable with the United States coming into fight on behalf of Ukraine if Russia invaded again, I think that would be quite dangerous and potentially very disastrous. I don't know if that's the security arrangement that has to be done. There's for instance, Vladimir Yushchenko, he's a Ukrainian analyst, and he's not the only one. They've suggested, what about, speeding up Ukraine's entry into the EU, give Zelensky some sort of win that he can point to his own population. And of course, that would have to be paired with a lot of economic aid, and not IMF loans, not payday loans, basically to bleed Ukraine, the Ukrainian population, but rather actual economic aid that rebuilds it in the same way that Germany was rebuilt after the Second World War. So that's sort of those are my responses, I guess, to what Eric was saying.
Yeah, I just want to say that I agree with. If I had the power, the United States would delegate the authority to, or rather, the West more broadly would delegate the authority to lift sanctions to the Zelensky government in negotiations. I do think that there is more that the U.S. could be doing to abet a peace agreement, and I would agree that the responsibility of Americans in general and the American left in particular is to pressure our government to do what is conducive to peace. I do think that to be effective in that role requires really trying to navigate and engage with where mainstream opinion is, and recognize sort of these complexities that I have been pointing to. I think that I will say that I just regarded the idea of the U.S. turning Ukraine into Afghanistan as a hypothetical, in the sense that Kiev's fall and what the U.S. should do in the event that we're arming an insurgency is the opposition to Russia and Ukraine rather than the sovereign government, remains a hypothetical scenario. I do think that U.S. policy was preparing for that because, as Branko suggested, the Pentagon did not think that Ukraine was going to hold out as well as it did. I agree that the U.S., its imperative is not the well-being of the Ukrainian people, and its lack of concern in that regard, has contributed, to a degree that it's impossible for us to determine because of what we don't know, but seems to me to have contributed to the disaster that we currently have. At the same time, I think that it was just not within the last decade, the U.S. was looking to have a reset with Russia so as to counterbalance against China. It's not generally as a part of America's broad grand strategy. Opposition to Russia is not, the central goal there, and that opposition has fundamentally, in my view, become more prominent due to Russia's own decision to begin, to respond to the Maidan with an invasion of Ukraine, and that is sort of what has soured U.S.-Russia relations to the point where we're now at this juncture. And so it is not clear to me to what extent the U.S.'s affirmative policy goal at this point is to fight Russia to the last Ukrainian, to bleed out Russia's resources, and to what extent that was sort of the game plan when the presumption was that the Ukrainian government was going to fall. And now it's sort of in this more ambiguous territory because the U.S. is confronting a situation that it did not anticipate. But Branko's points that the U.S. security state's motives are not purely humanitarian is certainly well taken.
So I'm to offer a question that maybe pivots and wraps up the conversation.
So now they've been talking about sort of what to do next, or what is to be done. And I think that I agree with them, that it is essential that the United States and the EU join the negotiations.
Right.
What I would like to see, frankly, is a general European peace summit, because the Ukrainian conflict cannot be, there will be no stable, long-term, durable resolution without also a fundamental reworking of the security architecture of Europe. Neutrality only works in a context where institutions understand what neutrality means, that there's a framework, a legal and diplomatic framework that enshrines that status, and that provides both incentives for Ukraine to stay neutral and obstacles for outside powers, whether NATO, whether Russia, to undermine or suborn Ukrainian neutrality. That will not come about in a regional context where you have an ever-expanding NATO and a boxed-in Russia that has become more and more aggressive in attempting to settle its own security problems.
Yeah.
So you need to both broaden the discussion and get the participation of the other relevant powers. It's essential. Yeah. Otherwise, and you pointed out that you hated the argument that the kind of salami slicing argument, where, first they take Crimea, then they take Donbass, then it's going to be, Kharkiv, then it's going to be Odessa, and pretty soon Ukraine is a single stop. Yeah.
Yeah. I said in the private chat that this kind of gave me flashbacks to arguing with like elderly Zionists, when the Israeli-Palestinian peace process was more of a thing, like, well, if you start giving up pieces of, little pieces of Israel, where's it going to stop? Like that's kind of my immediate bias, when I hear this kind of argument that, yes, before you know it, it's going to be, 3 square blocks of Kiev is going to be all that's going to be left.
It's also exactly the same argument that Russian nationalists were forwarding about, like, first it was East Germany, then it was Poland and Czech Republic, then the Baltic states. Where will it end? Will we even have Nevsky Prospect left? See, I can also do the questionable accent.
Fair enough.
But and it's completely inappropriate for Russians to make it. But somehow it's legitimate in this case. And notice that neither of those arguments take into account at all the preferences of the people actually living in those tranches of territory.
Right.
Most of all, I think, if they got to vote, it would just be, we don't care what flag is flying, just give us let us have peace and like something like a normal life. So I think that, yeah, you need a strong diplomatic solution, and it's going to need more than just the immediate belligerence to settle. The security guarantees that are essential and that were a bone of contention between Eric and Branko, those also can only operate in some kind of framework where maybe Ukraine has to petition all the guarantor powers, and a majority of them have to provide a rationale for why this whatever crisis requires the intervention of the security guarantors. Or maybe it's some kind of demilitarization basis where you just don't have the infrastructure for offensive violence within 400 kilometers of sensitive locations. But these questions need to be settled. They need to be agreed upon, and a framework for enforcing them, institutionalizing them, needs to be put into place, and that can't happen just with Ukraine and Russia.
Yeah, absolutely. I should also say that, Eric, to his credit, is not making this argument here. In fact, the way he put it was slightly unclear, but I think he's on board with the central idea that the U.S. should have more direct role in negotiations. But I have, I have seen quite a few people, like over a pretty broad political spectrum, that goes further left than makes me comfortable. That people would make this argument, that of people saying, like, basically, well, look, it's because the Ukrainians are the aggrieved party. They all we could do is impose severe sanctions and flood the country with weapons, but we certainly can't negotiate because that would take away, like, their prerogative to kind of have the the sole say on how the war ends. That it's like somehow it's like disrespectful to, like, the autonomy of Ukrainians for the United States to be involved in negotiations.
What an absurdity! As though the United States would not insist on having veto power over any agreement that the Ukrainian government negotiated. The idea that the United States is not a party right now is entirely a diplomatic fiction that's useful as essentially a negotiation ruse for the West. And if you're negotiating like this, why play fair, right? If the stakes are so high and sort of existential threat is on the horizon, I would argue that existential threat, at least for Westerners, is certainly not the case, and that you're better off approaching negotiations in good faith and trying to actually answer some of the thorny practical problems of how do we live together if we can't kill each other.
And I would also just say that this idea that, like, even apart from the fact that, as you just said, right now, as more, like, American politicians, I think, are getting more comfortable admitting, the United States is definitely a party to the conflict in any case. But, like, it's also this idea that it's, like, disrespectful to the autonomy of people who've been mistreated for the United States to both, like, aggressively encourage parties to a conflict to enter into negotiations or to be part of those negotiations itself. I think it's maybe worth underlining how radical a shift that would be for the traditions of American foreign policy, right? We were talking about, you were using the example of Ireland earlier, right? Was it illegitimate for the United States to play the role that it did in making the Good Friday Accords come about? Was that bad because it's disrespecting the autonomy of the UK and or Irish Republicans?
won't anybody think of the poor unionists, right? The United States has frequently settled international security questions at the point of a bayonet. Right. Not just the United States, right? Like, ultimately, that's how most security that's why they call them security problems, right? Is all of the bayonets. And there's a kind of, for me, this echoes the type of procedural, bureaucratic, I'd say cowardice, that Democrats frequently employ in explaining why they couldn't do something, why they couldn't achieve something, right? The congressional parliamentarian said we couldn't have universal health care. I'm sorry, everyone. As though the United States itself, or the executive branch, the government itself, is not a constitutive actor of this environment, but a passive party that has to receive verdicts from others. So the niceties of diplomatic affairs are supposed to be a lubricant that gets you to peace agreements, not an alibi to get you out of pursuing them.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Okay, let's finish this up.
It seems like there's two things going on. On the one hand, a lot of what you guys have been talking about so far is dealing with getting an accurate analysis of the situation, of the interests involved, so that we can get a better sense of the possible outcomes. But then there's also, this question of what the left's response should be to what's going on. That it seems like the debate really started with what the left's response should be so far. And that's how I've understood why you both have been discussing what's actually been going on. That should be informed. Our actual response should be informed by what's going on. But as we all know, the American left is virtually powerless. We do some ideological prodding and poking here and there, but the world really isn't made up of good ideas. It's made up of power. So the left doesn't really influence what's going on in any major way. Maybe a different way to put that is that the elites of the world, the various ruling classes, the American ruling class, the Western ruling classes, the Russian ruling class, the Chinese ruling class, they're all going to find solutions to this situation and others that fit more or less within their interests. So is the point of this debate that we're having is it, on the one hand, what is a better left strategy to influence the outcome of the war? Or is it, on the other hand, is it how do we have a greater understanding of these social dynamics of war, of sovereignty, etc., how to resolve these conflicts so that if the left is in a position of power, we can have better political solutions that lead to more democratic and egalitarian outcomes?
I'll go first. I think both. I think on the one hand, one day, God willing, the left will have more power in this country and everywhere around the world. And these are thorny questions that we'll have to confront. And when we make the decisions that we make, they'll actually matter instead of just sort of being a theoretical thing. And I think it is worth thinking about this issue. I understand the drive to, we want to help them militarily. There's a sovereign country that's being invaded by a larger neighbor. The stuff we're seeing is horrendous. Of course, you would not be a human being if you didn't have that response. But this has always been the trouble with liberal interventionism, which is it's driven by emotion and not always driven by thinking about the practicalities on the ground. And that we saw so many times this has led to disaster. The Libya misadventure is one of the clearest cases, but you could go through so many others. So I think, as I said in the piece, I don't believe in pacifism in every single instance, no matter what. However, I am very keenly aware of, both because of the realities of Ukraine, which most people are very uninformed about. They just have a very surface level good guy versus bad guy idea of what's going on over there. because people are, not because of the realities of Ukraine, but also because of the very well documented history of how military solutions, like sending military aid, like sending weapons and so forth into a country, can lead to long-term consequences. I oppose it here. I think this is the kind of analysis that the left should bring, when, God willing, they have power sometime in the future. Beyond that, I, as a journalist, obviously I write for people who are, lean politically in a certain direction, but I hope that to some extent, what I put out there has a bit more of an influence to some of the discourse. As I said, right now, the entire pressure on the Biden administration is just to do more militarily. There's absolutely no, the stuff I'm saying and the stuff some of the other, left commentators that Eric pointed to are saying gets almost next to no purchase at all in mainstream discourse. And I think that's kind of dangerous because if the only pressure is for the US to get more and more military involved, to draw red lines, then, it's going to bend to that pressure. I would hope that, there are other commentators, there are other people, if they are interested in helping Ukraine, they rather than going to protests where they're calling for a no-fly zone, they go to protests outside the White House demanding that Biden, enter negotiations, that he do something about this ceasefire deal. Remember that in his State of the Union speech, there was no mention of ceasefire. And I believe he actually, whether it was in that speech or sometime else, he said, this is going to take a long, long time. That is very worrying to me. And I think the best thing for Ukrainians, if we actually care about them, is not to have this be a protracted war. It should be to try and find a solution as quickly as possible. And part of that solution, I think, rests in having the US into negotiations. So, if anyone's listening to this, pressure your congressperson. Democracy is very limited in the United States. It doesn't mean it doesn't exist. It doesn't mean that popular pressure can't do anything. I think that's a better use of our energies, whether you're, a socialist, progressive, liberal, whatever. That's a better use of our energies than just sort of calling for more military solutions. And also, we should transition away from fossil fuels. That's my last thought. If there's nothing else that this should teach us, we're getting a very visceral look at how if you sit on a giant reserve of oil and gas, you at the very least have a perception of yourself as being able to act in a variety of kind of outrageous ways because you have this very powerful piece of leverage over the international community, quote unquote. So let's really use this moment to aggressively invest away from fossil fuels and change our energy system, and hopefully not all die in a climate apocalypse.
I would second a lot of what Branko said there at the end. I also think that it is more useful to, I don't think that arming Ukraine needs any more, that objective needs more support than it already has. Whereas I think that pressure on the Biden administration to not seek, not encourage, not seek a maximalist sort of agenda here, but try to facilitate peace. We need more voices calling for that, absolutely, as well as voices calling to forgive Ukraine's foreign debt and increase refugee admissions. I think that's the left's role is in the current context. I think is primarily to agitate for those things. I think that it's just important, given the opinion climate that we have, to really take seriously majoritarian sentiment on other aspects of the conflict in order for arguments along those lines to be heard and received with open minds. As far as does any of this stuff that we do matter, or are we just people who like to think about the world and argue, and so we do that, and we found a way to get paid a little bit for it, and I think we all probably have that existential moment of the soul, but I do think that it is a fact that Joe Biden, no one's idea, at least a few years ago, of a dove withdrew U.S. forces from Afghanistan. And in fact, the last 2 U.S. presidents, really the last 3, were elected on kind of anti-interventionist platforms. I don't think that, one can credit the left in the broadest sense for that exclusively, let alone the left in the narrow sense of the socialist left. Nonetheless, I think that there was a real role played there. And, the fact is that the people who staff the Biden administration, increasingly the rising generation of them, are, overlapping. Their media ecosystem and media diet overlaps with that of the left's, and they do confront these arguments. And I do think there is a broad, in addition to the funding of institutions, like the Quincy Institute or whatever, there are more non-interventionist voices that have an ear in, the Democratic Party, and perhaps maybe I'm skeptical, but perhaps the post-Trump Republican Party. So I don't think it's all totally pointless. I think that the discourse, there is a little bit of sort of elite suasion that can be done within certain very limited bounds. And then besides that, I think just sharpening the left's sort of internal sort of intellectual strength and health is a goal in itself. Especially since I think that it really is a very difficult an unintuitive landscape that we confront right now. There is no international socialist or workers' movement with any significant power. There isn't a, the chief rivals to American imperial power are both, fundamentally they're state capitalist. They are, if anything, more hostile to organized labor than the United States. So that it's just not obvious what the position in many of these emerging conflicts that are going to define, the next few decades. It's not going to be intuitive to people who broadly sympathize with the left where their values are supposed to bring them in those conflicts. And I think it's just important to have a really sort of open and vigorous debate about that stuff, so that we have both clear thinking and sharp arguments, even when we internally disagree.
Okay, well, I think we can probably end it there. Thank you both to Eric Levitz and to Branko Marcetic, probably 2 of our finest and most insightful journalists working today. So
thank you.
Thank you both for your time.
If you like this video,
All right. So,
some deep introspection on the role of left journalism and left intellectuals to round out the evening of depression.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Are you just have you just found a way to get paid for shouting into the void? Or
Exactly. Are you irrelevant or irrelevant and incompetent?
Exactly. Well, putting the relevance question to one side, Dr. Kuba here is the leftist who I know who has the deepest knowledge of the region and what's going on with the conflict. So what's if somebody watched that debate, I do think that they would be better off than most people, including most people on the left, are right now in terms of their understanding of some of the issues. But what's been left out here that you'd like people to think about?
Well, I think that the follow-on consequences, the knock-on regional consequences, I alluded to the potential impact of Ukrainian migration.
Right.
And it's likely that by the longer the conflict goes on, the more people will leave and the fewer will be able to return. And we've already got over 6 million, the movement of over 6 million people out of Ukraine. I think 10 million is entirely reasonable estimate for where we'll end up, maybe more. And recall the dislocation that occurred in 2015 when a smaller number of Middle Eastern refugees and asylum seekers arrived in Europe. In some ways, we've been warned that this is going to be an era of mass migrations. Ukraine doesn't seem to be a climate war in the conventional sense that it was precipitated by drought or other events, but it is a piece of an overall regional fragmentation of states, a breakdown of the area that could be considered under control by some kind of organized authority. Like the zone of anarchy, now goes from Kharkiv all the way to the Caucasus, through Iraq, through Syria, Lebanon, with other appanages in Yemen, and Ethiopia still experiencing a civil war. The Somali state was never reconstructed. Libya is still a catastrophe. So there's this widening cycle, this increasing circle of territory that's in more or less a permanent state of disorganized warfare. The one exception, what makes Ukraine exceptional is the extent to which the warfare is conventional. Right. But there's no shortage of other countries that have a similar collapse of security and human welfare. Those 10 million refugees are going to enter Europe, and I'm not suggesting that their arrival is negative, either for Europe or for them. It might actually be exactly the sort of shot in the arm that a demographically aging, shrinking population, shrinking economies need to revitalize themselves and to keep the wheels of the European welfare states moving. But those 10 million are 10 million fewer climate refugees, Middle Eastern refugees, African economic migrants, migrants from elsewhere, from Afghanistan, from Syria, 10 million fewer that Europe can absorb. And given that none of the failed states that were collapsed over the course of the global war on terror has been successfully reconstituted, I think that there's going to be a lot of people looking for a place to live a normal life that aren't Ukrainians. And this essentially will saturate the ability of Europe to take in more people. And if they do take in more people, I dread what the conflict between Muslim and Ukrainian refugees struggling for living payments from European welfare states, how that would actually play out. Right. It could be ISIS versus Azov on the streets of Paris.
Yeah.
And and similarly, even if it doesn't go that far, you might have a nativist backlash, especially by Western Europeans, by Dutch, by Danes, by Germans who are just sick of these refugees, whatever color they are. Or an exacerbation of EU Polish brinksmanship, where the right-wing government of Poland simultaneously needs to extort resources from Brussels in order to handle the Ukrainian refugee population it's settling, but also wants to use their sort of control over this demographic bomb, much like Turkey did with Middle Eastern refugees, to heighten brinksmanship within the EU. And then you might end up splitting one of the few stabilizing blocks. And I realize that that characterization of the European Union may be controversial with this group, but relatively speaking,
yeah, sure.
I prefer having the EU in this world than out of it. And so there are
Mhm.
there's a real need to settle this conflict as quickly as possible, because these traumas might become structures that not only capture the Ukrainian population, but undermine the institutions of stability that are essential for what we consider regular and civilized government in Europe.
Right. Well, that point about structures of stability does actually get to the last thing I wanted to ask you about, which is, so you mentioned the EU, which of course, sure, right? I mean, the left, certainly the socialist left doesn't like the EU, and for good reasons, right? I mean, look at Greece, but also, we just heard Branko say, that
maybe accelerated EU accession for Ukraine would be a good idea. It certainly played a tremendous role in stabilizing Poland after the end of communism, and to a certain extent, the prosperity that the EU undid in Greece was the product of previous EU policies. Greece enjoyed a tremendous developmental boost for decades because of its EU membership, and the fiscal sadism of Germany is, short-sighted and unwise, at the very least. I'll leave it at that because I don't like moralizing, but
yeah, right. I got you. So I mean, like, this is the, I mean, going back to the point about the sort of frustrated lack of influence on the left on any of this right now, like, just play pretend here for a second and imagining that there was some way that in the near future the some sort of meaningfully left force had any prospects for taking over the executive branch of the American state and like moving us towards the what we would all like to see, which is peeling back America's imperial military shadow in the world. Like, what presumably we think, okay, so we don't want to have this American empire with military bases all over the world. We don't want to have like regular American wars, etc. But one thing we also don't want to have is a bunch more regional wars happening all over the place in a less stable world. And it seems like, on the face of it, the way to kind of square that circle is to build some sort of international institutions that can make that could not just be vehicles for American power, but that could be like genuinely international institutions that could that could play a stabilizing role, that could make that could make the world that could play some role in containing all of that stuff.
And the EU, to the extent that we do have a real world model, there's a reason why I know that the EU is not popular in the chat, but I know that Gaddafi is, for instance, and because it's a weird world that we live in. But Gaddafi, his great vision for Africa was an EU-like structure, because he recognized that this form of regional multinational governance, let's call it, across developmental lines, across ethnic geographic lines, could serve as an excellent mechanism for diffusing rule of law structures, developmental assistance, without needing to be re-engineered from a hypothetical blank slate, right? The Soviet model failed. It's no longer around. If we may wish for central planning, but somebody needs to fix it first. Nobody's gotten it to work. The EU works, so that is a starting point that might be valuable. Introducing those kinds of structures regionally. One mechanism within the EU that's had played a great stabilization and development role was the regional transfer payments from high-income countries to lower-income countries for infrastructure, for various developmental projects, investments in new materials, new industries, increasing, I hate the phrase, but human capital. And the payoff for Poland, for Hungary, for Croatia, for Slovenia, for Ireland in a previous generation, for Portugal, has been phenomenal. And that money has also bought a much greater degree of security comfort, of law and order, of peace and stability, of regional comity and calm for the core countries as well. So it's not a purely philanthropic venture. While all of this labor and all of these resources that are brought in by the new member states also create profit opportunities in new markets. So I think that those kinds of institutions have potential. One important step is to prevent them from being captured, because that's the fate of most progressive institutions under neoliberalism, that you let in the McKinsey guys and now the termites are in everything. That is not code, I mean literal McKinsey guys like Pete Buttigieg fixing the price of bread in Canada. And I think that in this case, I think Eric is onto something when he says, when he talks about elite suasion. These institutions, whether American think tanks, state institutions, state departments, civil service, military service, international organizations, are staffed by cadres. There are people who do their jobs. And right now, those individuals have, the incumbents have been acculturated to a neoliberal environment which normalizes things like joining the board of Raytheon after the end of a military career. And that is bad. I'm not saying ethically bad. I'm saying it has bad consequences for security policy, for economic policy, for all kinds of outcomes. So if you can inoculate the elite through whatever structures of elite suasion Eric might practice, from those kinds of behaviors, create taboos around them, just like there are taboos around, in elite circles around overt homophobia or overt racism. Create those same taboos around taking the bag from the military-industrial complex. And I recognize the irony of this message being delivered by deep state Kuba, but the preventing the infiltration of institutions of power by these sectoral interests is just as important as designing those institutions to begin with.
Yeah, I would say, just going back to the point about central planning, because I don't think this is anything you would disagree with, but just for the benefit of anybody watching, I think it's true, right, that we don't know how to make Soviet-style central planning work. Maybe someday we will. You can read my review of Red Plenty and Current Affairs, but we don't right now.
Great piece.
Thank you. But I think it is worth emphasizing. I mean, as much as this, this sort of, to certain kinds of leftist ears, this sounds sort of,
heretical.
Yeah, maybe like just sort of like tepid and unexcited. But I mean, it's like, what do we know works really well, right? What do we know how to make work? A big social democratic welfare state that's allied to strong labor unions, right? I mean, that we actually have some extremely successful models of, and I think those are some of the most livable societies that humans have devised to date, right? So
you can have your radical cake and eat it too, right? For instance, one regional organization along the lines of the EU, we can envision a Caribbean community
right.
with a strong Cuban, Venezuelan social democratic axis. If we can get Cuba and Venezuela to become Sweden and Denmark, right? And then their good example could be propagated through the region. There's struggle for the sake of struggle is just as dangerous as cultivating civility for the sake of civility.
I mean, I think there are, reasons, and it's a much bigger discussion, but I do, there are both ideological and sort of strategic reasons that would, that weigh pretty heavily with me, to think that should be the sort of extent of our long-term ambitions. But I think the fact that is a workable model that we know how to do is a really important starting point. And I think that it's, and I think if you, and I also think that whatever, I mean, Mondragon, right? So, we know that if you do need a market sector at present, it doesn't, it doesn't have to look like Amazon, right? There are other models there.
And the breakthrough to new models beyond economic modernity, right? Beyond late capitalism.
Yeah.
I likewise, right? I think Konstantin Tsiolkovsky said, "The earth is the cradle of mankind, but one cannot stay in the cradle forever." So similarly, capitalism may be our kindergarten, but we have to graduate someday. That said, maybe in the meantime, our kindergarten doesn't need to look like a bombed out neoliberal hellscape, and we can actually have some nice things for a while. Let's get to that point before we figure out, what the communist space colonies in the rings of Saturn should look like.
Well, can't improve on that as Ned did. So Deep State Kuba here is part of the crew at the This Is Revolution podcast, which I believe the regular times are Monday and Thursday evenings and Saturday afternoons. Is that correct?
No. They start at noon Eastern on Saturday and 9 p.m. Tuesdays and Thursdays.
Tuesdays and Thursdays. There we go. That's right. Tuesdays and Thursdays. All right. Very good. So in any case, check Kuba out there. Anything else you want to mention before we go?
Are you going to be at the Sublation book launch, or the Sublation launch in New York in June?
Possibly. I'm
coming out, so it would be nice to see you there.
Yeah. Remind me of the date.
June 26th.
Oh shit. Yeah, I should be actually. This is a weird conversation to have on air, but I should.
Everyone pay attention. Sublation Books, New York, June 26th.
Yeah.
Sunday.
I actually just agreed literally a few hours ago to do a different event in New York on the 25th. So it would seem silly not to stay for that. So
Churlish.
And Churlish, yes, silly and Churlish not to deal with that. So fair enough. All right. Well, I will see perhaps some people who are watching then. I will certainly see Dr. Kuba then. You should watch him. This is Revolution on this channel on Monday. We are going to do our season finale because I'm about to go to first Greece and then the UK, so I'm going to be gone for a couple of weeks. So this is our season 3 finale with Sam Cedar on Monday.
Wait, are you doing a fiscal sadism tour of Europe?
It sort of feels like it. That's not the intention, but yeah, that's where else should I go on the on that tour that places.
Yeah, like maybe visit some of some real estate towns in Ireland, right? Like maybe your arrival is going to be what precipitates the Italian meltdown. I'm always waiting for that shoe to drop.
Fair enough. Yeah, it just kind of worked out in a strange way. There's something called the How the Light Gets In, which is a annual like festival.
Hey, that's another Leonard Cohen reference. Who started and ended.
It is. That's right. That's true. Yeah. So that's an annual festival that happens in Wales. So that's early June. So like Slavoj is going to be there. There are like a bunch of people like that. Who are there.
He's Slavoj to you. I see.
Yeah. Well,
name dropping your famous friends. Okay.
I also just refer to you as Kuba. Kuba. Like,
but that's just because you don't want to say it.
Just because I pronouncing your last name. That's not the only reason. That's also because you're my friend. But in any case, so that's happening in early June, and then a very good friend of mine is going to be in Greece doing this teaching a study abroad program, and right now actually, so he's staying around for like a week after that. So I'm going to visit him there before going to the conference in Wales. We're going to be off for a couple of weeks, but before that, we have the episode with Sam on Monday. So check that out. And I will see you then, and I will see you, Kuba, very soon.
Take care.